How good people turn into monsters. When kindness turns dark. What if losing yourself doesn't begin with a crisis, but with silence? This video explores a hidden tragedy, the slow unraveling of good people. Through Montaigne's lens and modern psychology, we examine how exhaustion, obedience, and self-denial can lead us away from who we once were without even noticing. It's not about blame, it's about awareness. How do kind souls drift into darkness? Why do those with strong values make small compromises that eventually change everything? We'll uncover how I'm just doing my job and just this once can shape identity more than intent. If you've ever questioned your own moral compass or feared becoming someone you no longer recognize, this is your wake-up call. Because healing doesn't start with strength. It starts with the courage to ask, who am I becoming? When good people lose themselves, the beginning of a silent tragedy, imagine someone who once lived with deep compassion. They always helped others without expecting anything in return. Always chose what was right even when no one was watching. A person seen by everyone as kind, trustworthy, and morally grounded. But over time, something began to shift. The eyes that once looked at them with trust now seem wary. They start doing things they themselves once condemned. No one understands why. But what's even more terrifying is, they no longer understand themselves either. This transformation doesn't happen overnight. It begins silently, slowly, almost imperceptibly. Maybe it was a lie told to avoid trouble. A compromise made just to keep the peace. A moment of silence when they should have spoken up. Bit by bit, they drifted away from who they were, not because they became bad people, but because they stopped asking the question, who am I becoming? And once they stopped reflecting, stopped stepping back to see themselves honestly, even the best of people can lose their way. We often think of darkness as something out there, a clear enemy, an obvious evil. But sometimes, darkness starts from within, from exhaustion, from pain, or from small cracks in our beliefs. And without enough awareness, even good people can walk paths they once feared. The question is not, when did they change? But rather, what did we miss when that change began? No one is invisible to darkness. The cost of complacency, there is a common illusion in many people's minds. I'm a good person, so I'll never become bad. But history and psychology say otherwise. Under enough pressure, in the right circumstances, and with enough internal erosion, even the kindest individuals can fall into darkness. And the most dangerous part isn't that they become worse, it's that they don't even realize they're changing. We tend to overestimate our own moral steadfastness. We believe we can control every choice, hold fast to what's right in any situation. But reality shows us otherwise. Instinct, fear, and social influence shape our behavior far more than we think. In Philip Zimbardo's famous Stanford prison experiment, ordinary students, given the role of guards, quickly became authoritarian and cruel, not because they were inherently bad, but because they believed their role justified their behavior. Likewise, Stanley Milgram showed that people could inflict real pain on others simply because someone in authority told them to. They didn't feel like they were being cruel, they were just following orders. But in that obedience, personal morality is replaced by delegated responsibility. And once we stop judging ourselves, darkness seeps in, as if it were the natural order. The lesson here isn't to provoke fear, it's a call to awareness. You don't become bad because you want to. You become bad when you stop questioning yourself, when you stop holding your actions up to the light of your conscience. The greatest cost of moral complacency is that once you believe you're immune to darkness, you've already let it in. Corruption doesn't start with crime, but with just this once. No one wakes up one morning and says, today I will betray everything I believe in. Corruption doesn't arrive like a lightning strike. It spreads like a quiet fracture, expanding day by day. It begins with things that seem harmless, a small lie for convenience, letting a wrong slip by to avoid conflict, a behavior excused with, given the situation, I had no choice. This is what psychology calls the slippery slope effect. Once you cross the first ethical boundary, the next ones become easier to blur. Someone who once vowed never to cheat might start by slightly adjusting a number, just this once. Then next time feels easier. and the time after that becomes habit. What was once unthinkable becomes, well, everyone does it. In these small acts, we begin to redefine who we are, from principled to flexible to permissive, to someone who can now do what they once despised without even feeling conflicted. What's heartbreaking is, most people don't realize this process is happening. They don't feel themselves changing because each step is too small to trigger alarm. But that's exactly how darkness works. It doesn't need to break you all at once. It just needs you to quietly drift from the light. Healing begins by looking back at those moments of just a little. Not to blame yourself, but to understand. If corruption starts with one small step, then the path back can also begin with one small choice. And in each of those choices, you are reclaiming yourself. When loyalty distracts from morality, not everyone who does wrong is driven by malice. Some do it because they believe. They had no other choice. They didn't mean to cause harm, but they complied. They followed orders. They obeyed a system, a superior, a pre-established rule, even when it went against their inner values. Stanley Milgram proved this in one of the most famous psychological experiments of the 20th century. Participants were instructed to deliver electric shocks to another person when they gave incorrect answers, all under the direction of someone in a lab coat, symbolizing authority. The result: most participants continued administering the shocks, even when they believed the other person was in real pain. Why? Because they didn't want to defy authority. Because they believed they weren't responsible. I'm just following orders. That phrase became their shield from guilt. In everyday life, we fall into this trap more often than we think. When a boss asks us to hide false data, when friends cheer on bullying, when society normalizes something harmful, this obedience isn't always driven by fear. Sometimes it's simply a desire not to stand out, not to be seen as difficult. But the cost of misguided compliance is the slow erosion of our moral compass. The danger is this: the more people comply, the more normalized wrongdoing becomes. And the fewer people question it, the more power the system gains to redefine what's right and wrong. At some point, conscience is no longer our compass. It becomes a whisper drowned out by the voice of authority. To heal, you don't have to fight the whole world. You just need to stand firm within yourself. To know how to say no at the right time is not betrayal, it's loyalty to what's right. And sometimes, the most courageous act a person can do is to protect their morality quietly, firmly, and alone. When us becomes the excuse to eliminate them, one of the most dangerous psychological mechanisms is when people divide the world into us and them. This division isn't just a mental shortcut, it's the root of prejudice, discrimination, and dehumanization. When we belong to a group, a community, an organization, a religion, or an ideology, it gives us a sense of safety and purpose. But at the same time, it can quietly implant the belief that those who are not like us are different, perhaps even threatening. And from there, those outside the group are seen as less valuable, untrustworthy, or worse, not deserving of humane treatment. Psychology calls this the in-group versus out-group effect. The more attached we are to our group, the easier it becomes to justify unfair behavior toward outsiders. We stop seeing them as people with feelings, wounds, and stories. We only see the label they carry. They're from that side. They oppose our ideals. They don't belong here. And once a label is strong enough, we can inflict harm without remorse. Human history is filled with tragedies born from this division. Genocides, wars, purges. All often start with one simple shift: seeing others as them. Not because people are born evil, but because they're led to believe the opposing side is no longer human. To avoid this psychological trap, you must hold on to one essential question: am I seeing this person as a human being, or just as a label? Healing begins when we remove the line between us and them, and start seeing each other as fellow human beings, also stumbling, also wounded, also searching. When you keep your humanity intact in a divided world, you don't just save yourself, you protect the essence of what makes us human. Why you tell yourself I'm not wrong, and why that's the most dangerous trap. One of the strangest and most dangerous abilities of human beings is our capacity to justify our own actions, even when those actions go against the very moral standards we once believed in. People can hurt others, betray their own principles, and still firmly believe I'm a good person. This doesn't stem from dishonesty, but from a subtle psychological mechanism, self-rationalization. Psychology calls this cognitive dissonance, a state of mental discomfort that occurs when our actions contradict our beliefs. And when faced with this inner conflict, instead of adjusting our behavior, people often choose to change their beliefs. Why? Because doing so helps us avoid guilt, avoid the feeling that we betrayed ourselves. And so, the person who hurts others says, I had no choice. The liar says, I did it to protect them. The one causing harm thinks, this is necessary. And through this process, corruption becomes smooth. No more friction, no more guilt. Everything is wrapped up in justifications that sound reasonable. And layer by layer, our conscience is folded away, boxed up, as if it never existed. But the most heartbreaking thing isn't that people justify bad behavior. It's that they no longer hear the voice inside that once resisted. That voice has been drowned by excuses, by fear, by habit. They no longer feel the conflict, and because of that, they no longer feel the need to change. Healing, if it is to happen at all, must begin by daring to face that contradiction. Daring to ask, why did I do this? What feeling am I trying to avoid? If someone else did what I did, would I be okay with it? These questions are uncomfortable. They bring shame, confusion, and disorientation. But from that discomfort, a new awareness is born, an awareness of the self, no longer manipulated by a fearful ego. We don't need to be perfect to live with integrity, but we must be honest enough to notice when we're lying to ourselves. And each time we choose to face instead of flee, we take one small step out of the darkness. You are not a bad person just because you've been lost. But if you stop asking questions, stop examining yourself, stop listening to your inner voice, that's when the real lostness begins. When you believe you're always right, you can no longer see when you're wrong. One of the great paradoxes of morality is this: the more we believe we're good people, the easier it becomes to justify doing harm. When someone builds their identity around being kind, fair, and honest, they begin to carry an invisible label: I am moral. And unless that label is regularly examined through humility, it becomes a distorted mirror, one that reflects a warped version of reality. Psychology calls this moral licensing. It happens when someone does a good deed, and then subconsciously feels entitled to do something wrong without guilt. For example, someone who donates to charity in the morning may easily lash out or insult someone in the afternoon and still believe they're a kind person, because in their mind, the earlier good deed becomes a moral pass for the bad one. The danger of moral licensing is that it stops us from self-reflecting. A leader who believes they're fighting for justice might begin to silence, control, or even eliminate opposing voices and still feel they're protecting what's right. They don't see themselves as authoritarian. They see themselves as guardians of justice. And at that point, the line between righteousness and tyranny begins to blur. From the belief I'm right, it's easy to slip into anyone who disagrees with me is wrong. And from there, criticism, offense, even punishment can be justified by the label of morality. Instead of living in awareness, people fall into the trap of moral superiority, where they no longer question themselves, because they believe, I'm on the side of the light. But true light doesn't come from standing above others. It comes from being able to doubt yourself, to question even your seemingly righteous actions, and to never stop examining the hidden motives behind your choices. The deepest healing doesn't come from believing I'm a good person. It comes from being willing to admit when you're wrong, and from there, to grow. When you dare to take off the cloak of morality, whether society gave it to you or you gave it to yourself, you begin to see more clearly what part of you is truly good and what part is just a shell covering unresolved shadows. You don't need to be right to be loved, but you need to be willing to be wrong to truly mature. And that is the sign of a soul with real inner strength. The collapse of moral boundaries, when we no longer see others as human there is. A dangerous moment in the human psyche, when we stop seeing the person in front of us as a person, not because we don't know they have emotions, pain, and a life of their own, but because, in our minds, they've been labeled a traitor, a bad person, a threat. And once the label clouds our vision, compassion quietly disappears. This is the process of dehumanization, a psychological phenomenon considered central to all acts of cruelty in history. From wars and purges to everyday acts of violence, they all begin at the same point, when victims are no longer seen as human beings. In the military, soldiers are trained to refer to the enemy using nicknames, not real names. In society, dissenters are labeled as enemies of truth. On social media, people hurl vicious words at strangers they've never met because they don't see a face, hear a voice, or feel the trembling behind the screen. Dehumanization doesn't always come from hatred. Sometimes it starts with fear, or from wounds that haven't been healed. When we are hurt, betrayed, or belittled, we easily begin to see the other as undeserving of understanding or forgiveness. And once we stop viewing someone as a person capable of change, we allow ourselves to treat them cruelly without guilt. The problem is, once dehumanization takes hold, any action can be justified. At that point, suffering is no longer seen as a moral consequence. It becomes collateral damage. Conscience freezes, and we tell ourselves they deserved it. But in that moment, we've lost a piece of our humanity. Healing isn't only for the victims, it's for the ones who've caused harm too, and it begins by restoring personhood to others. When you begin to see the fear, the vulnerability, and the past behind someone's eyes, you open a space where both of you can return to wholeness. Because when we see others as human, we are reminded that we are human too. And in a world divided, keeping your humanity intact may be the most courageous act of a soul searching for light. Everyday darkness, evil doesn't come from shadows, but from us when we forget who we are, when we think of corruption. We often picture those who commit grand crimes, people far outside the bounds of social morality. But the truth is quieter and more terrifying. Corruption doesn't need war, power, or ideology. It can begin in ordinary life, in small, unnoticed moments. A colleague gossiping behind someone's back, a family member using sharp words to manipulate emotions, a student casually bullying someone weaker in class. These aren't called crimes. They're just normal behavior, part of life. But it is within this so-called normalcy that morality slowly erodes unseen. Indifference doesn't arrive all at once. It grows from watching others get hurt and doing nothing, from choosing silence to avoid confrontation, from saying, "This isn't my problem," from the habit of dismissing others' pain because it doesn't affect us directly. On social media, people insult, degrade, and belittle one another more easily than ever, because the other person is now just a profile picture, a username, a piece of data, no longer a real human being. Even within families, deep wounds hide inside familiar phrases. Parents are always right. "I did this for your own good. You're just being too sensitive." These things don't need to be overtly cruel to be dangerous. Because normalizing small harms is what builds the foundation for larger acts of brutality. What's scarier is, many people still believe they're being moral, only because they've never been questioned, never faced the consequences of their actions. So corruption isn't a distant story. It's present every day, in the way we speak, judge, behave, in the way we choose silence or speak up. And the darkness doesn't lie elsewhere. It lies in the place where we've stopped asking, "Am I becoming someone I once didn't want to be?" Awakening begins when we dare to shine light on the most familiar behaviors. When we admit that we too, if we don't listen enough, reflect enough, or care enough, can become part of the darkness we despise. But from that awareness, we can choose again. No one is born to be cruel, but anyone can become cruel if they lose connection with themselves. And each small, conscious act in everyday life, a kind word, a thoughtful pause, a compassionate glance, is how we silently resist that darkness, with strength and with grace. Becoming aware of the shadow, the first fence before the abyss. There's one common starting point for all moral dissent: when we stop asking ourselves what we're doing and why we're doing it. In the darkness of corruption, the first thing we lose isn't morality, it's self-awareness. When we act without reflection, when we no longer listen to our inner voice, that's when the shadow begins to lead. Carl Jung once said, Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The shadow isn't the evil part of us. It's the part we refuse to acknowledge, the parts we suppress, reject, or disown. And when we aren't aware of it, it expresses itself through our behavior as anger, blame, control, avoidance, or emotional harm. In the process of moral collapse, few people realize they are changing. They still think they're doing the right thing because they've stopped asking questions. They no longer examine their actions, their motives, or the consequences. They live by psychological autopilot, letting the environment mold their identity little by little. Awareness is the first fence to stop that slide. When you begin to ask, why am I doing this? Does this action align with my values? If someone else did this, would I be okay with it? Then you are already casting light into the dark. And it's in this act of self-reflection that you preserve your humanity, not through perfection, but through clarity. A psychologically mature person isn't one who never makes mistakes. It's someone who never stops confronting them with honesty and courage. Healing doesn't begin by denying wrongdoing. It begins by looking straight at it, without justifying, without blaming, without running. And if anything can hold you steady when the world around you begins to blur, it's your living awareness of the shadow within you. The silent courage, when holding on to your values gets you rejected, staying true to your ethics, is not a glamorous act. Sometimes it brings no praise, no reward. Instead, it invites misunderstanding, isolation, even pain. True kindness is often quiet, and in many situations it comes with a loneliness that isn't easy to bear. Moral courage means doing what's right, not because anyone is watching, but because it's right in your heart. It's when you speak up for someone being mistreated, even when it makes you the next target. When you refuse to cheat, even when everyone else is doing it. When you choose to speak, even when you're not sure anyone will listen. Throughout history, many have failed this ethical test. Not because they were bad people, but because they were afraid of losing approval, afraid of being attacked, afraid of being cast out of the group. And so they chose silence. Silence in the face of injustice. Silence before wrongdoing. Silence as the darkness spread. But that silence is not neutral. It nourishes what is wrong. It strengthens cruelty. And it dims the flame of conscience within. Yet, there are those often very ordinary people who chose to stand firm, not to be admired, but because they couldn't bear the feeling of betraying themselves. And these small, quiet acts, though isolated, are where humanity is preserved, in a world sliding too fast in the other direction. Healing begins with accepting this truth. You don't need agreement to live rightly. You don't need support to be kind. And you don't need to wait for someone else to act first. If you have the courage not to trade your values for temporary safety, then you are already a light in the dark. In an era where pleasing the majority is easier than ever, loyalty to what is right is a rare form of bravery. And even if this bravery brings no applause, it is what keeps you whole, day by day, choice by choice, each time you refuse to betray yourself. It's not malice, it's the wrong environment that corrupts the good. When we think of evil, we often picture a particular kind of person born cruel, emotionally cold, morally twisted. But the truth is far more complex and heartbreaking. Most acts of cruelty don't stem from malice, they come from toxic environments. Philip Zimbardo called this the Lucifer effect, the phenomenon where ordinary, even kind people can become harmful when placed in deeply negative circumstances. Elements like pressure, organizational culture, silent consensus, fear of rejection, all create systems that encourage and justify wrongdoing. And within those systems, people gradually lose the ability to judge right from wrong. Imagine a workplace where dishonesty is seen as clever, where performance is valued over integrity, where silence in the face of injustice is something everyone learns. Soon, even honest people begin to adapt. Those who once spoke out choose quiet, not because they lost their conscience, but because they were trained to believe that authenticity leads to exclusion. Environment doesn't just influence behavior, it reshapes how we see the world, how we see others, and worst of all, how we see ourselves. A society that glorifies blind ambition, endless comparison, and results at any cost teaches people that human worth lies in achievement, not in character. And once that belief takes root, right and wrong are replaced by what is useful and socially rewarded. This truth is frightening, but it also brings hope. Because if evil arises from context, then goodness can also be cultivated by context. If environments can confuse us, they can also help us find our way back, as long as we are awake enough to choose. Healing here doesn't stop at returning to yourself. It extends into the active creation of kinder environments around you, choosing to surround yourself with value-driven people, walking away from spaces that numb your soul, contributing to communities where honesty, empathy, and courage are respected, because no one is purely a monster, and no one is eternally a saint. We become who we are based on what we accept as normal. And when you're brave enough to reject cruelty as inevitable, you reclaim your humanity for yourself and for the world around you. Forgiving yourself. You don't need to be perfect to return to goodness. After seeing the process of internal corruption, after confronting the painful truths about yourself, many people fall into a state of deep regret. They look back at wrong choices, at moments of silence, at harm they've caused, and begin to ask, do I still deserve a chance to start again? This is a critical turning point in the healing journey, because if awakening leads only to self-hatred, then darkness is still present. It's just wearing a different mask. Psychological collapse doesn't come only from forgetting morality. It also comes from believing that you've lost the right to be moral ever again. But the truth is, you don't have to be perfect to be forgiven. You only need to be honest. Forgiveness is not denial. It's not an excuse. It's the acceptance that, yes, I was wrong, but I am not the wrong I committed. Every person has the right to make mistakes. But what makes someone different is not their past. It's how they face that past. Forgiving yourself is an act of courage. It means looking directly at what you once avoided, admitting what you once justified, and returning to yourself not with pride, but with humility. You don't need to erase your past mistakes. They are part of what shaped who you are now. But you can choose not to let the past decide your future. You can choose to repair, step by step. An apology still unspoken. A kind act to restore some balance. A decision to stop the cycle before it repeats. And slowly you rebuild trust with yourself, then with others. No one demands that you return to being the good person you once were in someone's eyes. What matters more is that you become someone you can look in the mirror and not turn away from. Self-forgiveness is not a way to escape responsibility. It's what gives you the strength to live rightly, even after having been wrong. Because goodness is not a permanent state. It's a daily choice, one you make again and again, even if you're walking out of the dark. And when that choice is rooted in sincerity and awareness, it is always a worthy beginning. You don't have to wait for perfection to return to goodness. You only need the courage not to hide from yourself. And from that moment on, light begins to flicker, not from anywhere else, but from the heart that once got lost and still longs to come home. Rebuilding inner strength, mastering reactions, staying true to yourself after realizing how corruption can begin with small lapses, after daring to confront and forgive yourself. One question becomes more important than ever. How do I avoid falling back? How do I stay grounded in a world constantly pulling me away from my values? The answer lies in inner strength, not the flashy kind shown through strong words or a tough exterior, but the real kind, the ability to master your reactions, to stay calm amid chaos, to live by your principles even when no one stands with you. True inner strength doesn't happen by accident. It's built through small, repeated actions each day, from choosing to stay silent when anger tempts you to react, to refusing to join something that goes against your conscience, even if it means being excluded. It's the discipline to check your motives before you speak or act. It's the habit of asking yourself at the end of each day, did I live honestly with my values today? A simple but powerful practice is to journal. When did I feel myself waver? How did I respond? Do I regret it? Was I acting to please others or to protect my inner peace? These questions, repeated daily, become your internal compass, helping you stay centered when the world pulls. More importantly, learn to pause. In the space between stimulus and response, pause. Take a breath. Ask, is this reaction coming from a wound or from my strength? That quiet moment is where you reclaim your choice. And each time your choice comes from clarity, you add a layer of resilience to your inner core. Inner strength isn't about being hard. It's about not being easily swayed by emotions, by circumstances, by others. It's standing in the storm and still hearing the quiet voice within. You don't need to shout to prove you're right. You only need to be still because you know you haven't betrayed yourself. Holding your center in a chaotic world is a quiet victory, but a profound one. And every time you master your reactions, you're not only protecting your integrity, you're also preserving the human spirit in a time that desperately needs it. Inner strength isn't never falling, it's always being able to return to your center. And even if you've been lost before, you can rebuild from the inside out, wiser, steadier, and more compassionate than ever. The light in you was never gone, meaning begins. When you choose what's right amid mistakes, after all the analysis, the questioning, the confrontation with human darkness, one final question arises, gentle, yet profound. What are we living for, if not to become someone we're not ashamed to be? Corruption is real. Darkness is real. But here's the miracle. The light within us never fully disappears. It may be buried, forgotten, suffocated by pain, environment, or mistakes. But it's still there, waiting for one moment of clarity to be reignited. Meaning doesn't come from perfection. It comes from the ability to choose again. In every moment when you could react on instinct but choose to pause. When you could retaliate but choose understanding. When you could run but choose to stay and face it. These are small moments, but they carry the weight of awakening. We are not saints or devils. As Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote, the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. Each of us contains both light and shadow. And each day, with every choice, we decide which side to nourish. The beautiful truth is, no one can take that choice from you. No matter how far you've fallen, no matter how badly you've failed. The moment you choose what's right again, meaning begins to bloom. To live meaningfully doesn't mean living without mistakes. It means not letting your mistakes define you. It means rising where you once fell, and using that very fall to live with more depth, more wisdom, more compassion for yourself and for others. You don't need to be perfect to deserve light. You just need to be honest, humble enough to learn, and brave enough to begin again every single day. And in that journey, you will not only rediscover yourself, you'll rediscover the reason to keep going with a heart that has been wounded, but has never given up on what's right. True light begins within. Corruption is real, but so is the return. You don't need to play the hero or defeat anyone but yourself. You only need to recognize when you're drifting and have the courage to come back. Even in the dark, the light will recognize you, and that is enough to begin again.